All right. So my plan is pretty simple here. I'm going to introduce our panelists and let them talk a little bit about the classes that they want to reference, right? Just sort of thinking about the remote and hybrid lab strategies that they adopted either spring or the fall, so tell us a little bit about the class that you're thinking about or the lab that you're thinking about. Provide a little context, who are these students, how big it was, what the goals were, and then talk a little bit about something that you feel worked well, or at least well enough to share it to the group. And after we've had a chance to hear from the panelists then, and have a little context for the conversation, we can open it to conversation with everybody. So if you all have questions for the panelists or you want to share, I know that the participants have also often been teaching labs or will be teaching a lab in the spring. So have your own thoughts and ideas. So you can share what you did. You can ask questions. I have some questions in my back pocket, but we'll go with participants' questions first. And then hopefully the goal is that you come away with an idea that you could apply to labs that you'll be teaching in center term or in spring. So let's see, I didn't set up an order ahead of time, so I'm just going to use the order of the panelists as they appear in my Zoom window, which puts Kristen Fulfer first. So would you like to introduce yourself? I feel like we all kind of know each other, but maybe introduce more of the lab that you taught and the ideas that you want to share.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm prepared to talk about block 1. I taught General Chemistry 1, so our first semester General Chemistry lab. I had 24 students, about half first years, half sophomores through two seniors. I had a mixture of fully remote students, fully on campus, and then a number of them were in isolation or quarantine for 1 or more weeks of that. Additionally, so I had a mix of people on and off campus at different times. The time zone spread was 12 hours for my fully remote students. So it was an adventure, as we all had adventures, I'm sure. So our lab occupancy with physical distancing, I got lucky in that it was 12. And I had 24 students before knowing that there were multiple that were going to be full-time, not on campus. And so I think Amanda is probably going to mention this too. I know Claire already mentioned this, that she did A and B groups. And so we did the same thing in general chemistry. My section as well as the other 2 sections, where we had half of the students, 12 students, were invited to be in person and do an in-person designed lab on Tuesday and do a remote lab designed to be remote on Thursday. And the other group was the opposite, right? They were in the lab on Thursday. So we had a TA helping run a designed to be remote, completely different activity during the week. And I was in the lab facilitating an in-person activity as well as on Zoom facilitating a remote version of the in-person activity. So essentially 3 different things were happening every day in lab. And I will say the lesson I learned was that was very chaotic and hard to keep. So I kept my remote students together and that anyone who was in quarantine, isolation, or fully remote doing the in-person, but not really because they were a remote lab activity, I created those in Twine, which is like an interactive storytelling app, so that they could sort of get a feel for what it was like being in the lab. And there were video clips of things they would have seen in the lab. But it was hard to keep them engaged in that they weren't really there, even though they were on Zoom and could participate in the in-class sort of discussion part. That's all I got.
All right, thank you so much. I feel like there's already a lot to talk about, even with the challenges that you face, but let's go ahead and move to the next panelist on my screen. That's Jason. So Jason, do you want to tell us a little bit about your lab and your strategies?
Yes, and I have to apologize if the jackhammer in the background gets too loud, tell me. I have some foundation work going on the other side of my house, and it's very loud around here. So hopefully the lapel mic is helping with that. So I just thought I would talk about two different lab experiences that worked well. So in block one, I taught an upper level class. So it was my modern physics class. And some of those experiments lend themselves to a lot of analysis. And so one experiment, this gamma spectroscopy experiment, was, sorry, workers coming in and out.
I can't hear it all. I can't hear any noise at all.
Oh,
so
good,
you're
good. No, well, okay. So so this particular experiment was a lot of back and forth between data collection and then analyzing it. And so they'd have to, do something, with the buttons, get some data and then see if that worked out well. And if not, they had to go back and it was an iterative process, right? And so the way I wanted to get around that and do a fully remote lab is I made a video of how the apparatus worked. And this apparatus in particular was not very technically challenging, right? You set the software and then sit there for 5 or 10 minutes, collect the data, and then go analyze and come back. So after I made that video and we zoomed about how the experiment worked and what the apparatus did, then I basically flooded them with data. So I took scans, I took like 100 different scans, right? Some of which had terrible settings for the parameters, but that's part of what they learn, right? So they get one file and they kind of look at it and then it's okay, well, maybe I need to turn the gain up or something. They go find the other file. And so it really mimicked what they would actually do in lab, but without all the waiting in between. I talked to a student that I had last year and they were very jealous that they didn't get to do that experiment that way because, this group didn't have to sit around and wait for all the data. So that one actually went pretty well. In block 2, I taught the intro physics course and I started out doing that in person. I had one remote student, but he was in Lexington, so that really wasn't that bad. It wasn't 12 hours away, 12 hours time difference. But as the term went on, I had a couple more people leave, and the positivity rate actually spiked kind of toward the end of block 2. So I decided I wanted to do one fully remote, and I was shocked at how well it worked for that particular lab. So this was a conservation of energy lab, and usually we split it up in a typical term into 2 weeks anyway. So one is all the hands-on stuff, right? Collect the data, and that's pretty involved. And then the second week is analyzing that data. And I really like it for the intro students because they really struggle with it. A lot of them do. It's challenging, and it takes a lot of kind of walking around and kind of getting them over the little hurdles and just letting them have enough time to struggle. But at the end, you get this really great graph that really kind of spells out. It's like an aha moment for them, right? When they see it, like, okay, now I can see where all the energy is going back and forth, back and forth. And so to do that over Zoom, what I did was we all assembled in the main room, and then I split them up into breakout rooms. And so those teams would work, they worked for, 10 or 15 minutes and kind of got into it. And I'm kind of sitting there waiting in the main breakout room. I decided I wanted to stay there. So if anyone needed to get a hold of me, they could come back out. And so I thought, what if I'm sitting here all day and I don't have anything to do? That was absolutely not the case, right? I was busy nonstop for 3 hours outside of that first 10 minutes. But the dynamic really worked out pretty well because a group would come in and they would ask questions, and I'd help them out at the whiteboard or something like that, and we'd talk about it. And if another group came in, that first group really kind of felt the social pressure of, okay, well, maybe we should go back and start, continue and work and let the other group have their turn. I was kind of worried that I have like all the groups in the main room and like waiting for me to, hit them back and forth, but it really didn't work out that way. And the other thing it preserved was a little bit of productive eavesdropping, I guess I'll call it, right? Where if you're in the lab, you're explaining something one group, then another group is stuck on something similar. Maybe they hear a couple of little nuggets and they can get going too, right? And so some of that stuff happened. But not so much that it was, that people were using that as a crutch and just hanging out in the room. It was very much kind of a nice, orderly, one group came in, another group came and then left. And it really worked out well. I would say the one thing that I would like to figure out a solution to, so if anyone's got an idea, I want to hear this, but when trying to debug their code, right, I would have a student share their screen when they're in the main room. And so I could help them figure that out. But if another group came in, they'd be able to see that screen too. And that's just a little bit more eavesdropping than I would like. I don't want them to see what the other group is doing, but they can hear about it. They can hear, what we're talking about. So That's something I'd like to figure out before center terms. I'm doing a lot more kind of coding type of experiments in center term, and it might be necessary to kind of look at screens. And I'm really trying to figure out how to do that more efficiently. But that was my experience.
I love the Zoom success story, or at least mostly Zoom success story, for how that ended up working. I see that Jennifer has a suggestion in the chat, and maybe we can talk more about this after we're done with the panelists about this idea of kind of sharing work. But in the meantime, let's move on to our next panelist, Katie Ann.
Had to unmute myself. All right. So for first block, I had Intro to Psych, and I had a wide range of students from first years to seniors. And so that's always a challenge to teach, because it's a gen ed class, and the first years are there. A lot of them are there because they want to be psych or BNS majors. And then the seniors are just like, I want to just take this class and graduate. And so it's always a challenge to teach. One thing about it is we don't do as much traditionally, when we teach it in a long term, we do a couple of kind of hands-on bench lab kind of things, like we do an EEG lab and things like that. And I did not try to do that. I decided instead of trying to do the hard thing, I would do the easy thing. And so I adjusted my perspective and my expectations of the class, and had them do things that you could probably have them do as outside of class assignments anyway. And for that, I had them I had 3 labs that were case studies that I used from there's a website called the National Center for Case Study Teaching and Science. It costs $25 to use their things. We should have an institution license, and I don't know why we don't. But I just pay it because every time I think about it, it's like I need it, and my subscription is expired. So I just click the credit card and go. But they have a lot of great case studies, and then I set them up in Moodle as quizzes. And I put them in groups on Slack, and so they could work, discuss things on Slack, and work through the case study. And they had, I think they had like 3 days or 2 days to work through them. If I were to do it again, yes, that's what it is. Thank you, Robin. If I were to do it again, I might try to use lab time, or the lab time, to put them in Zoom breakout groups instead of the Slack, because some groups use Slack great and some groups didn't use it at all. And so I think if I were to do it again, I would do it in class and have them. I used the lab time for something else, and that's beyond the scope of this discussion. So anyway, I did that for 3 of them, and I didn't want them to get burned out on doing case studies. So for the second 3 labs, I switched and gave them, of course, it was social psychology, clinical psych, and I can't remember what the other topic was, but there were things that lent themselves to some podcasts. And so I assigned them podcasts to listen to, and then I put them into Flipgrid groups, and they discussed the podcast. One of them was on memory, and in this one, it was kind of fun because I ran it as an experiment. I could actually maybe next time collect data on it, but this time I just did it to see if it would work. But I assigned the groups were of groups of 6, and I assigned 3 of them one podcast and 3 of them a different podcast, and they listened to it, and then they had to post their Flipgrid comments without seeing each other's comments. I locked it all down so they couldn't see each other's, and then the next day, and they had to, can't remember whether they took notes on it or something like that, but then the next day, they went back and they had to watch all of their classmates' videos. Oh, wait, first they had to go and then listen to the other podcast, okay, before they got to see what their classmates said about it. And then they went back the next day and listened to all of the videos on Flipgrid. And so it was an experiment basically in what different people remember about the same thing. And then also how having listened to one podcast influenced what you remembered and learned from the next podcast. So there was 2 different memory components about that. And then again, on Moodle, I had a quiz where they answered questions, more reflective questions. They weren't technical or computational. But it did bring out a little bit of an experimental element to it. And there's things I could add to it to make it much more. Usually when we do something kind of experimental in Intro to Psych labs, it usually involves data collection, data analysis. And so that's something I could do in the future, but I tried not to bite off more than I could chew this time. So that's what I did.
So it seems like we're kind of developing these different alternatives. One is sort of figuring out how to use the technology to replicate what normally happens in the in-person version of the lab. And then another alternative is to kind of envision something different that might get at similar learning goals, but is kind of born in that remote environment. So it's interesting to think about.
I was fully remote too. So that's another thing, is I did not have a lab space to have my students come together and do experiments. Everything was remote. So that was the reason why I didn't even try to replicate a lab. I just said, this is my excuse to do something completely different.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Katie Ann. And so our last panelist is Amanda.
Well, that's a lot to try and follow up on. So I was teaching Human Anatomy and Physiology 1 in Block 2. And this is it's a 200 level biology class, but because of the way that typically things happen, I was teaching it to all seniors, maybe a junior or 2, but they were senior level in terms of enrollment. And so basically I knew right off the bat that I was going to have at least 2 students fully remote. And the reason for that is because I actually ended up having to add people off the wait list. And I was like, we can do this because the lab occupancy is this number, but because so many of you are remote, we can change this up a little bit. And like Kristen and I know Claire, we did this for 110, which I taught Bio 110 lab in the fall, but that's a different story. Or not in the fall, in Block 1, sorry. You know, things. In A and P, I also split into groups A and B for lab. And I did things a little bit differently. In 110, we had an A day and a B day. And what I had was actually in the first hour and a half of lab, for those students who wanted to or could, they could come in and work on identifying structures, muscles, tissues, things like that. For the remote students, I set it up similarly. They would Zoom in during that time, and I would have all materials scanned and put on Moodle for them. And I have to give Joe Steiga credit for that, because he taught it in Block 1, and he actually scanned all those materials in. So even though he's not here, I feel compelled to say Joe did all of that work. I have to do all that work for the spring because I'm teaching A&P2 lab, but that's okay. And so what we had, you know, typically when you are teaching an A&P class, you know, in 1, you're covering tissues, you're covering skeletal systems, muscles, nervous system, things like that. And typically what you would be doing is you would be looking at tissues under the microscope. You would be looking at bone models. You'd be looking at muscle models and dissecting, right? You know, we typically did cat dissections when I've taught human A&P before. And that was not going to work, right? For the types of dissection that you have to do for A&P, students have to really get in there and they're working together and they're close, and it's like, we can't do that. So fortunately, we had a number of cadaver images that I think are from Rebecca Kirk. And so we just scanned all of those in, put it in as a PDF, and then we would lay those out so that students who were in class could actually come in and walk around to stations to see the images, being socially distant. And students who were remote had access immediately to the PDF. And that actually worked really well because students normally we encourage students to come into lab outside of class and look over things, and like, that's not going to work right now. And so students who were in person also had access to that PDF and could look through things. So when it came time that we did that with muscles, we did that with tissues, we did that with nervous system. That worked really well. For a skeletal system, we had bone models and I'd laid them all out. And by that point, because I was having so many people jump between remote and in person, I was actually able to lay out individual stations for each student to look at the skeletons. And so that worked fairly well. And what I did is I actually brought a box of the bones home and recorded me using OBS, just talking through and pointing out all the structures on the bones, and had a lot of help from my cats, which the students really appreciated. And so I put those on Moodle as well for remote folks. And one thing I noticed was that during the in-person times, I would actually have students putting the videos up and actually walking through the structures in person on the bones while also seeing me walk through them. And I'm like, that's really cool. That's actually something that I might consider keeping. And I can do that with dissections as well, you know, once we actually go back to doing dissections. So I thought that was really, really neat. So that was basically an hour and a half of lab for students. The other half of lab was a case study. And we did this every week. I really wasn't worried about burning them out on case studies because so many of them are in the medical, like interested in pre-med or you know, physician's assistant, pharmacy, whatever. And I'm like, this is what you're going to be doing with your life. So you better get used to it. And so basically the idea was students who were in the early group would come in and work on the structures, and then they'd go do the case studies for an hour and a half. But I set it to do it midnight that night because I'm like, you know, it's fine. And a lot of the times the students that were in the later group would actually at least start the case study before they came to lab. And that was really great because then they can ask me questions about it. But basically I designed it so, and I wrote all the case studies because I'm one of those people. And so, you know, I had a page and there were questions on that page. And then students weren't allowed to scroll to the next page until they'd opened up or until they'd answered all those questions, right? It was a little bit honor system-y, but, you know, the idea behind that was, okay, what do you think? Here's the, you know, what do you think you should do? Here's the next step. Here's what actually got done. Is this what you thought? Why not? You know, that kind of thing. So very reflective. I wanted to, I kept telling them over and over, I'm not necessarily grading you on whether or not you get the right answer. I want to see how you're approaching the problem and I want to see you think. And so that was basically sort of how we did that. That's a good idea. I hate Moodle. And like, it was way easier for me to grade the Word documents. But Katie just posted, and that's why she had everything in Moodle. I'm like, that's a really good idea. I just really hate Moodle. And so basically, I really liked the case study approach. And, you know, from what little feedback, I haven't been able to see the course evaluations yet, but from what Joe said, from what his students said, and from what little feedback I've gotten from my students, they really liked it and they really appreciated it. And so that's something definitely moving forward that I think I'll want to keep thinking about.
Thanks, Amanda. Okay, so now that we've heard from all of the panelists, I want to bring in the rest of the participants. Do you all have questions for the panelists or experiences that kind of connect or amplify some of the points that they made, or maybe different experiences with some of these same approaches? So feel free to put a question in chat, but we're a small group, so also feel free to just unmute and just jump right in there if you have a question or a comment or an experience to share.
I'm just going to say with Amanda, you know, in 295, and I know Genevieve's here too, in our human neuropsych or physiological psychology, whatever that class is, $295. We do the brain dissection, and when we had to go remote in the spring, I just took pictures of all the brains and sliced them up and put flags in them and did all of that. But you're walking through the dissection and talking about all the parts and putting the videos on there. I didn't have the time to even think of doing that, but if I were to do it again, that would be a great way to approach that. There's also some online videos from the University of Utah that does neuroanatomy, but they have human brains, so which are cool, but I'm not sure how I'd make a quiz out of that. So that's yeah.
I could actually talk to Jennifer's question as well about Zoom. I didn't do this as much in lab, but I did it a lot in lecture because we were doing case studies in lecture during lecture time as well. And it's actually really easy for students to call for help in breakout rooms now. And so like, that's what I would do a lot is I would be sitting in the main room and I would pop in and check on them. I could just join the breakout room and I would say, okay, how are you guys doing? Do you need anything? And then after that first round, I'd go out and wait, right, and help the people in person and wait for students in the breakout room to call for my help. And they did that fairly regularly. And so then it was easier for me to just pop into the breakout room. But yeah, it's pretty easy for students to move in between the breakout rooms and the main session.
Yeah, there was a recent update this fall that allows participants to choose their own breakout rooms and move that I haven't actually tried out. And Jason, you unmuted. Were you going to speak to that? Did you?
No, my comment was I thought it was more efficient than the call for help and then the requisite delay that happens when you're kind of trying to jump back and forth, or when you get a request and you're in another breakout room. Then it's kind of up to you to say, I'm going to leave you guys and go help this other group right now. I found it more efficient and a little bit more palatable to have them come back into the main room.
Yeah, so my understanding is that with the update, it could be, for instance, that you would set up topical breakout rooms and then students could actually move to the topic that they're interested in talking about. I can imagine that being like a exam review or whatever if you move to the place. But I think everybody has to have an updated version of Zoom. And so the stumbling block would be making sure that the students have updated their version and that I can imagine some technical confusion getting that going. So I haven't actually done that myself, but that's the idea of the new update.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'll be teaching Psych 210 in the spring, and I know we have 2 people in the room that are teaching our 205, which is basically research methods and statistics. And we do a lot of data collection in those classes and then analysis. So I appreciated Jason's sort of breaking up of collection versus analysis. I think that could be helpful. The other thing I noticed, Jason, is you have a giant whiteboard. And I think I'm going to have to do that. And I guess I taught this class in the spring when we kind of jumped in, and I thankfully had already done most of the statistics at that point, sort of problem solving. But I think the thing I'm trying to figure out is, and I'm sure there are people in this room who have figured this out, is when I normally teach this class in person, we do a lot of writing problems on the board and the students solve them and show me how they solve them and show the class how they solve them, and we see the mistakes, and that's super helpful. And so I can imagine me having a whiteboard, but I'm trying to think about, honestly, the easiest way for the students to create that. So Kristen says Jamboard. I haven't used Jamboard, but I mean, this is something where students are writing, and my experience has been that I don't know how to get them to, I find it really difficult to write in like a laptop without a stylus. So I wonder if all my students have, that's what I'm trying to figure out, is how to do that. Go, Kristen, why don't you talk to me about that?
Yeah, so Gen Chem 1, again, lots of algebra, and they struggle immensely, some of them, with remembering basic algebra and unit conversions and, well, how come I got this crazy answer? Well, you didn't convert units, right? Or you multiplied instead of divided. It's always something like that. And so they were sharing their work using Jamboard. So I had a class Jamboard, and sometimes I had individual group Jamboards, so that they couldn't necessarily see other people's work, but they could only see the 2 people they were working with, but I could see everything. So because it's through Google Suite, you can set up sharing and customize sharing pretty much however you want. But the ones that, because most of my students didn't have, I think I had 2 students that had a tablet and a stylus. So the nice thing about Jamboard is you can put the app on your phone for free, and you can actually use your finger, zoom in, use your finger and write. Or if you don't want to do that, you can actually, what I was having them do is write on paper, snap a photo, and you can instant snap a photo from your phone and place it into the Jamboard. And then other people can circle things on it. I could circle things on it, be like, here's where you went wrong. So it was actually really nice for sharing math or any sort of like problem diagramming. And it was really easy, again, to just, there's literally a button in the Jamboard app that's like, take a photo with your phone and place it here. And then you can like zoom in or do whatever.
Did anybody use a different solution for that sort of thing? I know that's something that Candace and Christy have talked with lots of people about, kind of thinking through how they might replicate the kinds of writing on the board that students would normally do or problem solving. Was there a different solution that anyone likes? So there's a thing called Rocketbook that I heard about from actually Patton's husband, Joe, who teaches physics at Sayre. And I don't know if anybody's used that. We bought one, and then I don't think anybody checked it out to look at it. So I'm not entirely sure, but it seems to be like this. There are notebooks that you write in, but there's a sort of, it facilitates upload to Google, kind of like you can take a photo and it kind of like is already sized and like easy to link. And then you can also erase it by heating it. So you can reuse it over and over and over. So it's sort of like designed to facilitate the transfer from paper to a cloud. So we do have one of those, and there's something like $20. So it would be, if you liked it, it would be something that you could actually ask students to buy as supplies for the class. And then they could use and reuse. So that's another idea that I've heard of, but don't have a lot of experience with.
So then they'd have to have a microwave in their room as well?
I think they mostly do. Yeah, there's various versions that are differently erasable. One of them's heat, and I think there's another version that erases differently. I think the idea is just that it's sort of like registered, easy to kind of connect to a Google Doc that would help students organize all of the photos that they're snapping. I think that's the main idea, is that if you're doing some sort of, not just working out a sample problem in class, but some sort of, series of calculations that rather than having a million photos, it kind of is already set up to work well with, I think it's Google. And so then you wouldn't have to buy multiple notebooks. The idea is that it's erasable. So you just have the one, and you can use all your labs in the semester in the same notebook, and then have it be in the cloud as well. So yeah, like I said, we have a really old one, and then we have a new one that we bought in the late summer. That's both are available for checkout if you want to play around with them. All right, other questions or similar experiences or struggles and issues that you'd like to share? Andre. Oh, you're unmute. You need to unmute.
To myself. So I taught Anthro 120 in the fall, which is sort of introductory human origins. And it doesn't have a lab. It doesn't have a 4th hour lab, but it has a lab, kind of a third of an hour. I don't know how I would figure that out, but I was entirely remote. And I had made this sweep down at Center one day, one afternoon, one evening, grabbed just loads of fossils, brought them home. But while I was there, I set up everything exactly for the labs, and then wrote up a little lab manual. And then the 2 assistants simply took that over and did that. and they just totally took to it. It was wonderful. They managed it. They knew what they really didn't need my help. I have to admit. We interacted a lot over students, for example, students who were also remote, so they needed pictures, and so we worked together to get pictures of the stuff that we needed. And that was actually a good, frankly. Maybe it's just the days after the pain or something like that, but I feel it just sort of added another layer of, I don't know, organization or backup to the class. But in any case, the assistants, they were just terrific, and frankly, they just carried the day on that. And I think they liked it. I think the assistants got a lot out of it as much as the students. So that part of the course, again, I feel went really well. I will just say that the remote exams was a huge problem in there, and I hope never to have to repeat that aspect of it again. I mean, whatever I'll do, I'm not really sure, but I don't want to read exams like that again. I'll just leave that anyway. For center term and spring term, I teach 2 courses that use the GIS and remote sensing software that are loaded on computers in the social science lab. And spring term, remember spring term? I was teaching one of them, and so ITS set me up. I mean, it was really kind of very science fiction to me, or miraculous, so that the students could remote in to the machines and then access the software that's loaded there. So that actually worked really astonishingly well. I mean, I'm not at all happy about how the course went in the spring, but still, that part of it worked well. So I'm looking ahead to doing that, and I'm kind of in the process of trying to set up those syllabi, and I just have this sense of, okay, some of this I can foresee where it's going to go, and the rest I just don't know. For the center term course, I have an assistant who taught it with me before. He's terrific. He emailed me a couple of weeks ago to say, look, I've got 7 weeks in which I'm not doing anything. Can I offer you 7 weeks of free labor? So I'm trying to figure out how to use his free labor in helping me with my remote sensing stuff. But I just don't exactly see how it's going to happen. The room is too small for students to be in there during the class. I'm not going to be there, right? It's center term. It's 3-hour classes or whatever. Each student is going to be doing what? Two students can't remote into the same computer at the same time, right? So I guess we'll be Zooming together, but all the work that they'll be doing, they'll never be able to do work all of them will never be able to do work at the same time in the lab while class is happening. They'll all have to do that separately. So that's a little disconcerting, and I'm not really sure how to anticipate what's going to happen with that. I don't know if anybody has kinds of experiences or thoughts on what this is all going to look like.
Yeah, I mean, Andre raises a couple of issues. Assessments, which, is definitely something that I think often has to look different if you're dealing with remote students. I put a draft of a guide that I'm working on, but I don't know that there's a silver bullet. Like I keep seeing the same suggestions over and over about remote assessments. Either you basically do the Red Queen problem and you just try to get better tech to beat the students' better tech, or you rethink the assessments to something that's harder to cheat on, which works better, I think, in some disciplines and classes than it does probably in others. And so, yeah, assessments is a kind of an open question, and then software and remoting in to particular applications or other ways to solve that problem. So any experience that anyone wants to share on either of those? I mean, these are naughty problems, right? So,
I know for us in MATLAB, it's like a per seat license. So you're not VPNing into a particular computer, but it's just like a license, and you have so many licenses for the campus. I'm not sure what it looks like. I think that would be something ITS would have to say. Do you need to go into a particular computer, or can you just have up to 20 people using it at the same time or something?
They have me with, I have to tell them which two students will use each computer. And they will then allow those students to access only that computer. And then I have to tell the students, you know, Billy, you have 8 to noon, and Becky, noon to 4 or whatever, and you can.
So are you trying to get 2 students to work together on the same computer
It's
during
just
a lab
that
period?
in a 3-hour class, part of the idea is always, you know, let's start doing some work. Let's see how this goes. Let me show you how it's going. You can work along with me. I mean, I guess I can just have it where, I mean, in fact, it's never possible for every student to be doing that, because
Right.
there are too few computers than there are students. This is a legacy that I'm dealing with every year. The administration and I fought this out, and the administrator involved is gone. So I don't have to blame anybody now, but they basically, at one point I had 7 computers, and they said, well, you can have 4 students per computer, so your class is going to be capped at 28. And we finally fought that down to 14, but there's like 8 computers in there.
What if you had a student in class and then a student paired with that student who's on Zoom, and they shared the screen, or they just shared the desktop, and so the student watching on Zoom could collaborate using headphones so that they could, you know, not be too loud.
But they're not interacting with me then.
Well, you can be, yeah, I mean, I think you would have to think about what that could look like. But I think in terms of having students collaborate on a computer, they can each have individual Zoom sessions with a partner, and then just switch out who's in the room actually holding the mouse and who's online collaborating and trying to figure out what to do. You might have to split it up differently, because since it might feel less organic for you to talk a little while, have them do the thing, but I think it could be figured out. And that's how I would have them look at the same computer at the same time.
I would be Zooming separately with each pair of students. I'm sorry.
Students would collaborate over Zoom. Maybe we can talk about this specifically a little bit later, but I think that could work. Or use breakout rooms. That's true. That's a very good point. Students would be in breakout rooms with their partners, and then they could come back to the main session and you would be there. Yeah. So we can talk through those specifics. Does anybody else have questions about or ideas about either assessment or kind of collaboration around specific tools or software?
So I was one of those people who had to radically change the way I did assessment. And so, you know, I sort of stole Kelly O'Quinn's idea for Quizzans. But then for like lab practicals or things like that, and if I was going to do things a little differently, I would probably expand this a little bit. Because of the block scheduling, I didn't want to do full-sized exams because that just seemed like a lot. But for like the lab practical, I would have an identification portion, which was through Moodle. But then for a bigger thing, I would again do a case study exam. And students were allowed to collaborate with each other. They could use OpenNote, OpenBook, all of that. The only thing they couldn't do is use the internet. And so basically I sort of policed that by saying, every time you use something, you have to cite it. And so they had to cite the notes, they had to cite the textbook, they had to cite each other. basically. And so like they would like, I got this idea from, you know, Andre, or I got this idea from Katie Ann, right? And so that was a really easy way for me to sort of be able to tell if somebody had used something they weren't supposed to. Or the other thing that somebody had asked about, and I ended up going, yeah, this is the other way to do that. I had a number of BNS majors who were like, hey, I know about this from this class. And I'm like, okay, tell me what class you got that information from. And so that was another thing they could cite. But that actually worked pretty well. It did make for much longer exams because I did the same thing for physiology in the spring, comparative physiology. And so students were, you know, taking much longer on the exams, but again, it's open note, open book, open collaboration. So I actually liked that. And I think I might stick with that in some cases.
Yeah, a lot of the approaches to assessment that don't kind of rely on trying to lock down cheating, just sort of embrace like, okay, so everything's open. The task is different now. It's not remembering the list of 5 things from the textbook. It's different. And just saying basically all this kind of collaboration is fair game because it's really hard to police against it, as Alex's slate of academic integrity cases this December indicates.
Yeah, I guess for mine, I also made mine open note, and the kind of the constraint that I think I just set a time frame when they had to start it and then when they ended it. And so what I think they quickly learned from the first exam was they just couldn't look up everything that I think some of them thought they could. They quickly learned that there just wasn't enough time to do that, to finish the exam on time. For a lab practical for my entomology class, that one was a bit trickier because I was doing that all remote in terms of the identification. And so what I did is I created a Google Slides document for every single student. And I took pictures of insects from all these different angles, put them in there, and that allowed each of the students to kind of, if they wanted to, kind of blow up the images to zoom in. And if I just put it all in one document, it would have been a whole bunch of students just messing with all the photos. So I just had to create a document for each one of them. And yeah, it was a lot of work taking pictures of lots and lots of insects from all these different angles. Some of them were useless angles, I knew, but that was part of the fun. But yeah, it worked out pretty well. I was also going to bring up another thing that I did with my classes is I actually did do field trips. And so those were to the Central Kentucky Wildlife Refuge. We obviously couldn't all pile in a van like we normally would. And so I had them individually drive out there, and then we wore masks the entire time, which in the first block, that was pretty brutal because our masks were completely soaked through with sweat. And then the second time in ecology, I had to march up the steepest hill, which was painful to do with a mask on, but they all did it. And then I had them walking up and down super steep slopes to collect data. We just spaced ourselves out, and it seemed to work okay. And I think, yeah, obviously the remote kids couldn't participate in that, but we shared the data that we collected. And then some other labs I had us do, like we went out to the cemetery to collect demographics data. I had the remote kids find cemeteries near them and also collect that data and share it. So, and then they were able to use some of our Danville data, but also their own data that they collected on their own too. So.
Thanks, Mark. And actually, that reminds me, I was going to ask participants who aren't panelists, does anybody have anything that was so awesome that you want to share it? Anything that worked really well that you did in your lab?
So I could also,
yeah.
Sorry.
So
I also used the National Science Foundation case study database. Mm-hmm. And ever since I've started teaching ecology, I'd thought about teaching them myself, but I actually thought it'd be more interesting to have the students actually teach the case studies. And I think that works really well. It takes actually a fair amount of work on my end too, in terms of working with them to make sure they know how to use the case study, how to make it their own, and what they need to be able to communicate to the students. And I leaned on that really kind of a lot more for my labs in ecology this year. Normally it would just be used during class time, but I used it as part of the labs. And it was interesting kind of seeing how students would use the technology, because I had some students that were remote and they were part of a mixed group with people in person. And it was kind of, yeah, trying to work out the technology and kind of how well that would go for everybody involved. But I think it worked really well. They're really creative in terms of how to use Zoom in different ways to get a lot of participation for people in class. And then in class, every single person had a whiteboard that they could also write on and share with the screen. They could show it on the screen, and that seemed to work quite well. And I was pretty happy with how it turned out.
Cool. Thanks, Mark.
One of the things I'll jump in is that some of those, that they try to do a really good job of keeping them off the web, but they are out there, the answers, so to speak. So I always go in and tinker with them. You know, I at least change the names and you know, and sometimes I change some of the circumstances so that even if they look them up, they still have to figure out that they have to make that mental adjustment. They can't just copy and paste. So.
I have something different I want to bring up, which is this fall, I've been the posse mentor for 10 first years. And the thing I've gotten to, so I meet with them almost every week for an hour each. It's pretty great in terms of getting the other side of what classrooms are like and what this experience has been like for students. And I want to highlight one particular thing, which is that being first years has been really difficult in terms of making social connections that students would normally make in the classroom. And so what I really love about labs is that we have extended time and we often use group work. So I would just encourage you guys to think about, and I think a lot of you do this already, but I just think to recognize how important it is for students to be forced to interact with people that they might not normally choose to interact with. So I think that what I saw by having students of color and first generation students is that they, not all, but sometimes ended up quite isolated in a class because they didn't naturally create connections or didn't reach out. And so I think doing group assignments is great. I love that, Erin. But I think, yeah, things that aren't just in the lab, but like that, and say you have to work with a partner and assign them a partner. I think that's really key, because then they have someone when they go to study later, they have someone they already have met because of the class. And that's just something I really saw, that students who had that already facilitated by a professor had something to pull on, but ones that were either working alone or weren't, it was kind of optional, it didn't happen as much. And I think I think it happens unequally. So I just wanted to highlight that.
No, thank you, Jen, so much for kind of bringing us to the student experience, right? I think talking about this technological solutions to problems in our pedagogy can take up all of our time. And I do think it's really important to recenter ourselves on that student experience. Any other reflections from panelists or other participants about the student experience? What you felt was working for students, or what students were struggling with as you saw them navigate these remote and hybrid labs?
So I will say, so with the Bio 110 lab, in the first block, we had more remote students, and we were like, well, we'll just put them all in a group together. And I don't think that really worked very well. Amanda knows what group I'm talking about. So we changed things for the second block and made sure that every single remote student had the group, in-person group members. And it worked really, really well. Like, they were responsible for, like, I mean, we did a lot of hands-on stuff, dissections and plating bacteria. And we made the remote person responsible for reading directions to their in-person, group members. So as they were, plating, they could see, we set up their laptops so they could see, everyone was zoomed in. We did breakout rooms with their groups. And so we set, their laptops up, they could see their group members plating, and they would read them the directions, or see their group members dissecting and reading in the directions. So that worked a lot better. And I also will say having larger groups worked better from block 1 to block 2. So in block 1, we had mostly partners. We had some 3-member groups just because of uneven numbers. But having the groups was great. And we set it up to where we tried to have a range of students. So we had, you know, freshmen with, you know, a junior and a sophomore and a senior if possible. And that was really great. I had this group in block 2, is these 3 like junior and sophomore level girls with a freshman boy, and they like ragged on him, but he loved it. Like, he was so great and he had a great experience. Like, it was hilarious. And like, they would talk about like, hey, let's meet up for like lunch. And, you know, so I really, you know, pointing out what Jen said, like, it really was great because I saw a lot of community forming in my lab because they were forced to work together, you know, in person and on Zoom meetings, you know, when they did their virtual days as well. So definitely going to keep the groups of 4 in the spring and definitely assign groups again. But overall, I think it went well. I mean, considering the circumstances. So.
Yeah. That's great. And I see the hands. I just wanted to kind of reiterate, I love the idea of the remote student having a role, because I think it can be easy for that student to get lost in the shuffle. And so if they have something they're responsible for that lends itself to being on Zoom, I think that that's a great idea, Jason.
That was my question. Was my fear was in having, like, if you had a group of 3 where 2 were in person, that the remote student could get left out. And so I was always careful to pair one remote and one in person, and we just had like 2 cameras set up, one where you could see the apparatus and the other one where you could talk to the person, right? You could see their face, and so that kind of enabled communication a little bit better. But I guess I was wondering if that's an unfounded fear that remote person would get left, because that was something that I definitely didn't want to do, was have a group of 3 with one remote. I don't know if anybody else has different.
I mean, for Bio 110, it worked well. There were, I mean, for the remote students in block 2, it was usually like one remote member, or, you know, especially during block 2, we had a lot of quarantine and isolation movement. But I made everyone in lab pull up their laptops, everyone zoomed in, and then everyone got put into their breakout room with their group. And I mean, and one of my students who was in and out of quarantine, so that he felt it was great. He still felt connected to class, and that he didn't feel like he was just doing anything remotely by himself, and stay connected to his group. So I mean, it worked well for how we set it up.
Cool. Mark, do you want to?
I have more of a technical equipment question for Claire. So I know for my entomology class, I try to set up a microscope and use Zoom and stream from that, but there was just way too much lag, and the resolution was just so bad that it was pretty pointless, and I gave up on it pretty quickly. But I was curious with Claire, because I know you guys use a lot of microscopes in Bio 110 lab. Like, how did you work that out with the group work?
Yeah, so I mean, so actually we made the microscope lab a little bit more individualized this past semester, just because, you know, we can't like have them sharing microscopes, you know, like moving between scopes. And then with our remote students, mostly what I did is I either took images myself or found representative images online. We also did videos for things that they were supposed to, like, you know, for pond water, we found some good pond water videos on YouTube to have them watch and identify. And then to do a little bit of group work with that microscope exercise, we did this like diversity detective. So the in-class people had a slide to look at, and then the remote people had a slide image to look at. And then they all had to collaborate together to be like, what group of life is this? And what do we think it is? So, but yeah, I mean, unless you have like a really good microscope set up to where you can easily stream everything, we just had to go for sort of fixed pictures and like videos that we found.
Those are some great ideas. And I want to highlight something that I was going to say before, which is that you don't have to necessarily create all the resources yourself, right? That there are often places, so they have pros and cons, right? Answers might be out there. They might not be perfectly what you want, but they also don't involve you doing all the videos yourself of pond water or whatever. To get back to the question of remote students, some of the things that I've heard of are, so I like the remote student reading the instructions. The remote student can be like the fact checker, right? Or in a conversation, or they can have the reference open. So maybe the, you know, people there, if they have a factual question who are in person, rely on the remote student, and that's a way to give them a role. Also, because the remote students on Zoom, it's actually really easy for them to give presentations because they're not masked and they're on Zoom and they can be on the big screen. And so maybe that's the person who's responsible for providing a synopsis or some other kind of presentation that comes out of the lab. And again, kind of giving them that central role where they can be seen, I think does help weave them in. All right, so we're at 11. So I just want to kind of formally end this and thank everybody, thank the panelists for taking time out of their day, and for the participants also for sharing. If you want to keep talking, or if you have specific questions, feel free to stick around. Otherwise, good luck on finishing up your grading, and we're here at CTL if you have any questions that we can help with. I agree, Claire, it's nice to see everybody.
I'm gonna throw, I was hoping that Melissa Burns-Casado might have been able to attend, but just to pitch this out there, she, and maybe Genevieve knows something about this, but she actually mailed eyeballs and crickets and everything and cockroaches to her students that were off campus. And so Carolina Biological, I'm sure if you're like me, you get the email from them twice a week saying, we'll ship stuff to your students. And so, yeah, so that actually.
The college's swag, that the college said that they were going to send swag out to students.
It was really a box of 50 cockroaches.
Was it a box of cockroaches? Very nice.
I think 50 was the minimal order that could be mailed to a separate address. But I think they might have been dead when they got there. So
they were dead when they got to one student's house who was, yeah, that was good.
Katie and I both know, so it's the same story.